fact or fiction when it comes to longevity with Dr. Stephen Austad. That's coming up on the Longevity Lab. Welcome in to the Longevity Lab. David Lamb along with Dr. Stephen Austad. Dr. Austad, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you as well.
All right, now you recently returned from a little vacation. In conversing about this, my idea of a vacation and yours, they're a little bit different. All right? So you and the wife went to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me how that went.
That went very well. We kicked around in the jungle looking for various critters, which is what we like to do.
Right. Her background is...
She's a veterinarian.
Okay.
So, and she's been in field biology with me for many, many years. When we first met, she was a unpaid field assistant of mine in Venezuela. So she likes to kick around in the jungle as much as I do. But we understand that that's not everybody's cup of tea.
So you guys were in beautiful Costa Rica with these amazing beaches, and how many beaches did you see?
We saw zero beaches.
Zero beaches.
Zero beaches, but a lot of jungle.
There you go. So whenever you marry a longevity expert with a background in biology, the vacations look a little different. So you look rested and ready for our conversation today. It's going to be interesting. We're going to get into some myth busting, if you will, a little later. But one of the things I'd like us to do is kind of pull from the headlines what's going on in the longevity field, because so much is being written and studied. It's quite the talker. So there is Harvard Gazette. Do you subscribe to the Harvard Gazette?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not.
Well, the Harvard Gazette had this headline. It's a dietary swap that could lengthen your life. Study finds replacing butter with plant-based oils cuts premature death risk by 17%. All right, so you checked this out yourself. So I'm curious, these kind of findings, these research papers, if you will, they are certainly fodder for being shared, because anything that can cut fat, lose weight, that's the $1 billion industry, losing weight, living longer. So your thoughts on this study from this is actually Harvard's the new study out of Mass General Brigham and the School of Public Health and the Broad Institute. So your thoughts about this study? So replacing butter with plant-based oils cuts premature death risk by 17%. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't think it's time to throw all your butter out at this point.
Hang on to that.
This kind of study is what we call an observational study. That is, you're not asking people to do anything except live their normal lives, and then you just follow them for a very long time, and then you survey them periodically and say, well, what are your eating habits? What are your exercise habits? What are your drinking habits? And at the end of a few decades, you hope to see which ones live longer and which ones live shorter, which of those habits were best correlated with the longevity. Now, for this particular study, there's a whole number of weaknesses. Nothing weaker about this study than most studies that are like this. It's just that the nature of these observational studies is that it's very difficult to make definitive answers from them, and I'll tell you why. Okay. First of all, this study depended on what's called a food frequency questionnaire. That is, every 2 years, they gave people a questionnaire and asked them to fill it out about their dietary habits.
So they're trusting that folks are being honest.
Honest and having a good memory.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, I give my students this same questionnaire every time that I teach a course on aging.
Okay.
I give them about half of it because it's a very long questionnaire. It's a couple of hundred questions. A lot of those questions have multiple parts to them, so it's really long. So I just give them about the first half of it. And then I give it to them again about a month or 6 weeks later, because I'm assuming that their dietary habits haven't changed, but I wanted to see how consistent their answers were.
Okay.
And what I find is that they only give the same answer about 50% of the time. So 50% of their answers have changed. And And you can see why this is. If I ask you, David, how often did you eat green vegetables per week in the last 2 years?
No way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they ask you a lot of detailed questions, not just about green vegetables, but they ask you green beans, and what about peas, and what about spinach? And so there's a great deal of error just in people's recall, not to mention the fact that they might not be honest about the answers. The other weakness is that they can only do the association with the things that they ask you about. So, for instance, if they didn't ask you about, we know longevity is associated with level of education. The more education you have, the longer you live.
Right.
Maybe they didn't ask any questions about education. Or maybe there's something else that's important that they didn't ask. Maybe the people because there's ways to statistically control for differences in education if you ask that question. But maybe they didn't ask a question about where they lived. So people from more disadvantaged backgrounds might live in more polluted areas, but they didn't talk about their neighborhood. So there's a bunch of things that they may not have asked that may have made the difference. And the fact that the data that they get from these questionnaires might not be accurate. So why do they even do these studies if there are all the problems? And the reason they do is they're cheap and they're easy to do. So all you need to do is you just need to have a computer and you need to give people surveys. And the problem is that you can't make any definitive conclusion from any experiment, like for any one study like this. You can make conclusions, though. There's a couple of instances where you can take a study like this and you can say, okay, that really solidifies what we already knew. And one of those is if there have been a bunch of studies using different techniques, different populations, and they all come to the same result. So if you do a dozen different studies and from all over the country, and they always come out that eating butter as opposed to eating, olive oil is always makes you shorter alive, then you can probably rely on that.
Okay.
The other instance is when the effect is huge. When the effect is so huge, you figure, well, if they neglected to ask one key question, it wouldn't really affect the response. So a good example of that is effect of smoking. Effect of smoking increases your chances of dying by about 30-fold of cancer. And so that's such a large effect, you figure, well, there's no other question they could have asked that really would have changed that. So if the effect is huge, or there's been many, many studies that all come to the same conclusion, but from reading dietary studies that quite often you say, well, this study says this, and this study says that, and you have 12 that say this, and you have 8 that say that. And in that case, I think you just say, well, if there is an effect, whether it's a positive and negative effect, it's going to be a small effect.
Right. All right. So you've been in this field 30, 40 years studying just what, this kind of stuff. So with your experience and what you believe, what you've come to believe, what is proven, is there a takeaway from the findings that replacing, that butter may not be so great for us?
I would say we don't know. We don't know. Remember, it used to be that nobody wanted you to eat butter because it's got all these saturated fats.
Right.
They wanted you to eat margarine.
Yeah.
And then the advice switched.
It did.
Because there were a few more. And that's the kind of thing that you get from this. There's more studies. It's not that there's a better answer now. It's just that the later studies showed something that the earlier studies didn't say. Yeah. So my thought is, if the studies switch like that, then the effect, if it's there at all, is probably pretty small.
Is a part of the challenge for someone in your position not to be sucked in by those who want an easy answer? Okay, so all right, if I cut out butter, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to live longer, and the rush to judgment rather than that intentional, deliberate approach that will take time and takes a number of studies like this. Is that a part of the challenge of someone in your position?
Yes. The problem is what's called recency bias.
Yes.
So this is the latest study, right? It came from Harvard.
Let's take it and run with it.
Ooh, yeah, it's an impressive place. That in itself masks the fact that the nature of the study itself only leads to very, very weak conclusions. Yeah. And Harvard scientists have a way of making it sound very authoritative, because that's what Harvard. I used to be a Harvard
You did.
researcher, so I know
Right.
the game, right?
Yeah. And they know there's something about if Harvard's name is attached to it, it's probably gonna go get a little more notice than
That's
some
right.
unknown university.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Interesting. And then we'll try to do some headlines, kind of rip and read, if you will, as to what's out there. Dr. Stephen Austad, and the reason we're having this conversation, this podcast, you're the distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Biology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and scientific director at the American Federation for Aging Research. That leads us into our almost a fact or fiction, myth-busting conversation. Got 4 or 5 headlines, if you will, of findings that, like you said, that they do seem to have a life of their own. They've got some momentum. I'm curious your take after being involved with longevity and aging research for how long?
35 years.
35 years.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The first one, genetics determine everything. True, false?
False. For aging, certainly false. A lot of people think that the only way you're going to live a long, healthy life is if you had long-lived, healthy parents. And that's simply not true. There's been a lot of work on this starting really in the early 20th century. Alexander Graham Bell, of all people, was the first person to look into the genetics of longevity. And it all points pretty much to the same place. It doesn't matter if you study people, or if you study mice, or if you study flies. It all points to about 20 to 25% of how long you live is determined by your genes, which means that 75 to 80% is determined by other things. A lot of that certainly is going to be determined by your lifestyle.
Yeah. All right. So I'm curious about this because, as you and I have discussed, my dad passed away at the age of 48. He had a massive heart attack and passed away. And to me, 48 is way too young. And so every time I've gone to a doctor since that day, and they ask about my family history, you could just see in those physicians' faces, it's almost like a red light goes off, and there is such a belief, especially 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that it was almost as if it doesn't really matter what you do. It was a very negative. The future, because of your genetics, you're just like a ticking time bomb. How and when did the change take place to where it was not the be-all, end-all, your genetics?
Well, I have to say, in your particular case, dying of a heart attack at 48 is exceptionally young, and it was exceptionally young, even a while ago. So that's something that could have a genetic basis. And that doesn't mean that you're destined to die young, but it does mean that you need to pay special attention to your heart health. But generally for aging, except for the people that have certain genetic mutations that are going to give them certain diseases, it's really all about your lifestyle factors. Right. Except there is another exception. For people that have extreme longevity in their family, so they have 3 relatives that live to be over 100. In that case, their genes matter, and they might be able to live to be 100 even with crappy lifestyle factors. And
I've heard you say, you and I have had this conversation, and if you want to live a long time, I don't remember exactly how you say it, but first of all, if you really want to live to be 100, have someone in your family who's lived to nearly be 100. That's kind of something you say quite a bit.
Right. Yeah. If you want to be a healthy 100-year-old, you better have the right parents. If you want to be a healthy 80-year-old, then you can probably do that with the right lifestyle choices.
Right. All right. So genetics do not determine everything. Lifestyle choices, like you say. All right. The second one, let's talk about supplements and superfoods dramatically extending life. The marketing around this sector is intense. And it's like it's kind of amazing and overwhelming. If you click on any ad on Facebook or wherever you're on, and you just happen just to check out an interest, you're hounded for the rest of your life by the number of ads. So supplements and superfoods, can they dramatically extend your life?
Simple answer, no. We don't know of any that do that. which is not to say that people necessarily should avoid them. A few years ago, I was giving a talk, and somebody stood up in the audience and they asked me about a particular product. And it's a product that I know a lot about, and it has absolutely no impact on your aging at all. And I told them that. And their face fell.
Right.
Said, "Oh, I've been doing this for 25 years,
Right.
and I've never had a cold. I've never been sick." And I said, "Then don't stop.
Right.
Don't stop, because the placebo effect is a wonderful thing. And if you think it's doing you good, then maybe it is doing you good." So there's that side of it as well. The other side of it is, well, it's not really doing you any good. The thing that it's doing for you is it's giving you very expensive urine because you're getting rid of most of what you eat.
All right. So again, because of the marketing and the promises that are made, some of these promises are this absolutely, without a doubt, I don't even see how they can make these claims if they're not proven, but they really are bold in their claims that this is going to extend your life. You're going to live longer. You're going to have more energy. All of these claims, you're saying we should approach all of them with skepticism.
Absolutely. And I think this has gotten worse lately. I don't recall people making the extreme claims that they're doing now before, because they're patently untrue. At least there's no evidence to support what they say, but yet they're suddenly making all these claims. Well, if you want to slow aging, take this. And part of it is the fact that the supplement industry is completely unregulated. So there's been multiple studies that show that the supplements that you get, even from the best supplement sources and stores,
Right.
may or may not contain what it says on the label. About a third of them in one study were found to contain absolutely zero of what it said on the label, and it contained a lot of stuff that wasn't on the label. And right now, we don't have any way to to basically validate that what you're taking. There are ways that there are certain companies that will basically ask an outside group to test their products to make sure what's on the label. But this is a really important problem, is a problem that the FDA has no control over,
Right.
because of the Supplement Act from about 20 years ago.
All right. So are there any supplements, any special, any superfoods, anything along these lines that either you take yourself or you would recommend someone make a part of their daily lives?
No, I take nothing myself, so I don't take a multivitamin even. But that's because I'm an evidence person. I want to wait till there's evidence that it does me some good. And right now the evidence, and there's a ton of it on multiple vitamins, is that they don't do any good unless you have an absolutely horrible diet. Right. That doesn't mean, though, that people, if they make people feel better,
Right.
if they make them feel more secure to do that's fine. It's just, don't expect that they're going to do miracles for your health, because they're not going to do miracles for your health. The way you do miracles for your health is you eat sensibly, don't eat too much, do plenty of physical activity, plenty of mental activity, plenty of socializing.
All right. Perfect segue there. Physical activity. Another thing that you hear a lot right now, exercise needs to be intense to be beneficial. Not just to walk in the park. You need to hit it hard. You need to do a lot of sweating. Fact or fiction?
Fiction, I would say. Now, that's not to say that doing extreme amounts of exercise are bad for you.
Right.
Probably a little bit good, although you can overdo it. A friend of mine has the largest study of 100-year-olds in the world, and he's looked very closely at their lifestyle. And what he finds is that there's no extreme exercisers in his 100-year-old group. There are no marathon runners, nothing like that. Now, that's not to say that running marathons and all isn't good for your health. It's good for keeping you healthy, right, but it's not necessarily good for making you live longer. I calculated once that the optimal amount of exercise that people were asking you to do at the time, the evidence was that you got about that same amount of extra life. So if you want to live 2 years longer, but you spend 2 years doing exercises to do it, then if you want to do that, that's fine if you enjoy doing exercise. But don't think that it's going to increase your life dramatically. What it is going to do, though, is increase your health dramatically. And I think most of us want to be able to do the things that we like
Yeah.
to do when we get older. And that's where it comes in handy. You want to be able to carry your grandkids up the stairs, then you need to have had the kind of exercise or physical activity, because, even a walk in the park, even walking up the stairs rather than taking the elevator, even those small amounts, that all helps. We evolved doing a lot of physical activity. We had to feed ourselves. It's only recently that most of our lives have been sitting in chairs.
Right. So, conversely, are you a proponent of moving, of not just sitting around, the negative aspects and the impacts of a sedentary lifestyle and the toll that takes on your body?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. A friend of mine says, sitting is the new smoking. And so I think it's really important to be active and to be active periodically. Like sitting in a chair for 10 straight hours and then getting up and exercising is different than getting up and walking around every so often. So it's important to be. I think about it, our bodies are adapted to the way we lived for most of our history, and we've been around about 300,000 years. Most of that time, we hardly ever sat. But on the other hand, we probably hardly ever ran full speed either. We just were walking through the forest, planting stuff, doing domestic chores. All that stuff actually turns out to be good. Now that we have all this automation, now you don't have to do your dishes. Now you don't have to. Now you don't have to sweep. You vacuum. Now you even have a robot that vacuums for you. So all of that is probably not good for our health. A friend of mine calls modern life a state of exercise deficiency, which I think is a good way to think about it.
But all of that technology can free up your time to where you now have no excuse not to exercise. So that's the
absolutely
yeah,
right.
There's no reason for you not to. All right, another one. Aging can be reversed with anti-aging treatments. You hear a lot about these.
Yes, and on that, my thought is you can define reversing aging in a way to make that kind of true. For instance, if you've never lifted weights in one of the things that happens with aging is that we lose strength. Right. And even the people that work out all the time lose strength. So 50-year-old weightlifters can't lift as much as they could when they were 25. Right. But if you take somebody who's never lifted any weights and they get to be 80 or 90 years old and you say, hey, let's start a weight training program, they can gain an amazing amount of strength. Does that mean that they've reversed their muscle aging? I say not really, because the muscle cells are still old. They've still gone through everything. They're still more likely to break down. But what you've done is you've really slowed down the rate at which they're getting worse. Okay. And that we can do at almost any age. And that's something that's new. If you talk to a doctor in 1960 and said, look, I want to put a 90-year-old on a weight training program, they would look at you like you were nuts. But now we know if you put a 90-year-old on a weight training program, particularly if they've never been on one, they can have an amazing increase in their strength in a relatively short time.
Yeah. So what do you make of, and I'm just going to throw out some outlandish claims that are out there, the blood of younger people, the transfusions, or some of the more outlandish things. Is it the epigenetic clocks? How old you really are versus what your birth certificate says. So those kind of the interest in that and those sort of means to reverse aging. Skeptical.
Well, here's a difficult point. Both of the things you mentioned show some promise, and there's some evidence to suggest that they might be true. It's just that we don't yet know. I mean, and also when you go from the laboratory, from you go to the research environment till you go to the commercial environment, things change, because the commercial environment, people just want you to come back and keep buying their product. So a friend of mine did one of these epigenetic age tests. He took a sample of his blood and he split it into 6 different samples, and he sent the same sample to 6 different labs and asked about his biological age. And they came back, his age ranged from about 22 to about 68.
That's discouraging.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the commercial place that you are now. So that the epigenetic age shows some real promise. We don't know exactly how well it does. And these things, by the way, were invented to look at population changes, not to look at your change or my change. Right. And so what it tells you about your individual age is uncertain. Now, an interesting anecdote. I was at a meeting of about 30 of the basically the best known aging researchers in the world not long ago. And one of the people that invented the epigenetic aging clock was there, and he offered to give everybody a test.
Okay.
And so we all stood there and got our blood taken, and 3 weeks later we got our test results. And when I talked to him about the results, it turned out that of the group, and these are a group of people that study longevity, you'd think they would be, and they're all college professors or high-profile researchers. I think they all have a younger biological age. Right. No, that turns out that the average age for this group was exactly what their calendar age was. So I don't know what to make out of that at all. I liked my result. My result was about 6 years younger than my calendar age, but I don't put much stock in that because I don't know what that means at this point.
But you do feel a little better about yourself.
Well, yeah.
That means
and
6
if you
years
wanted
older.
me to pay for it the next time, I'd probably pay,
Right.
but only if he guaranteed that I could be even more different.
If he could go into double digits.
That's right.
That's
Then that'd be worth about twice as much.
All right, final one. Caloric restriction, the key to longevity.
In animals, this is certainly true. If you give an animal all that it wants to eat, and then you give a similar animal 40% less than that, they live longer and they stay healthy in about every way we can measure. Translating that from animals in cages or vials and all to humans living in a modern society, it's hard to make that translation. Are we talking about taking obese people and putting them on a diet and returning them to a healthy body weight? Of course that's going to make them healthier longer. That's not news, right? The question is, we took people at a healthy body weight and we reduced them to a very, very slender, you might say emaciated body weight. Would they stay healthy longer? And in that case, the evidence is very, very murky. I was on a TV show once with somebody that was doing this. He was doing it religiously. He was a computer guy. He was a war games expert. He could tell you everything that he'd eaten for the last 30 years. Oh my. And he was excruciatingly thin. And they said to him, we said, well, we want you to do something for the show that shows you're physically active. So what should we do? Oh, wait, we've got a swimming pool. How about if we take a picture of you swimming from one end to the other? He almost drowned. He literally didn't have any strength. He had no body fat, so he was like throwing a sinker in a swimming pool. And they also gave him a complete physical. And this person who'd been restricting himself seriously for 15 or 20 years, his heart looked great. His vessels, his arteries looked great. He said, he was 45 years old. He said, but your bones, they look like the bones of a 75-year-old woman. Oh, my. So this whole time it really weakened his bones. He had no muscle mass at all because he said if he did too much exercise, just made him hungry. And so you put these things together, low muscle mass, low bone quality, in an older person where the probability of falling is not trivial, then you could be asking for real trouble. So we still don't know about total reduction in calorie. What we are starting to learn, though, is that a period of fasting every day is probably beneficial in many ways, and that is eat what you want, but eat within a defined time limit. Try to get all your food done within 8 or 10 hours.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, and I hope you don't mind me saying this. We've been on some other media appearances together, and you've volunteered this information, but that's one of the things you practice personally, isn't it? The intermittent fasting, kind of limiting when you eat?
It is, but I was doing this a long time before this research came out. It just was my natural habit because I don't eat breakfast.
Okay, no breakfast. Your first meal of the day is around
11 o'clock.
Okay,
your last meal is around 7. So I have about an 8-hour window.
That 8-hour window.
So that means 16 hours a day I'm fasting. And we know after about 8 hours, your body goes into what's called a fasting physiology, which increases a lot of your defenses against things like oxidative damage, damage to your DNA. But I didn't start doing this because of that. But when it started to come out, I went back and I spent years and years and years doing these dietary restriction experiments in mice. Mm-hmm. And when I think about it now, I'm kicking myself for not noticing. But when I'm doing those experiments, when I go in every day to feed the mice, they are hanging on their cage waiting for me, and they gobble their food down and nothing flat. So in that case, I was really doing a 23-hour-a-day fasting experiment of them, in addition to doing the caloric restriction. And it never occurred to me that maybe it's the fasting and not the restriction that's having the effect. In reality, I'm thinking probably they both were important. But what we know now, you want to maintain a healthy body weight. Okay. You don't want to be too thin. You don't want to be too heavy.
Right. And relative to our conversation, let's kind of land the plane here. But where is a good spot to leave our listeners in terms of these heavily marketed, sometimes outlandish promises and claims that seem too good to be true? Where should we kind of plant ourselves if we're interested in living a long, healthy life?
If you're interested in living a long, healthy life, don't put your money on the drugs, the supplements. Just think about what we already know is a healthy lifestyle: healthy eating, healthy body weight, good sleep, plenty of physical activity. If any of these truly worked, can you imagine the number of people that would be flocking to them and the number of people that would be looking much, much younger than themselves? Actually, one of the things that's come out is that if you get a dozen people to guess your age, and they guess your age consistently lower, consistently higher than it is, they're actually onto something. The human brain is a very good pattern recognition device. So there have been studies that showed if you show people passport photos of various people and you ask them how old they are, if they score consistently younger than they really are, they tend to live longer.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. All right. So if you want to learn more about Dr. Stephen Austad, StephenAustad.com, what all is on your website?
A number of essays from books that I have written, recordings of talks that I've given. I try to put, if I have any upcoming public talks, I try to put them on there. And I'm probably going to start writing little short pieces, possibly related to what we talk about after the podcast, so that if people want to find out more or want to ask me additional questions, that'll be an opportunity.
Yeah, a great resource there for sure. StephenAustad.com. Check it out. We'll get the podcast up on there as well. Steve, thanks for the time.
I can't hardly wait to the next one.
Yeah, let's give it another go. And thanks so much for being with you. We'll see you next time right here on the Longevity Lab.